Imagine with me for a moment that everything you've seen in movies about steam trains was just a beautiful illusion. Soft music, elegant windows, and a traveler sipping a cup of tea while watching the sunset. But the truth was something else entirely. Imagine closing the carriage door behind you. Then a massive iron monster begins to roar, spewing thick clouds of black smoke, shaking so violently you feel your very bones rattling against each other, and filling your ears with an endless, deafening noise, not for minutes, nor for hours, but for days, and perhaps for entire weeks. Now, ask yourself honestly, could you sleep in a place like this? Can the human body surrender to sleep while the ground trembles beneath it endlessly? The air is heavy with the stench of coal, and darkness swallows everything beyond the window. What's even stranger is that millions of people actually did it. They had no other choice. They were traveling inside a massive iron monster, and every passing night was a new battle between man and exhaustion, between the desperate need for sleep and the fear of never waking up again. In fact, some journeys were so incredibly long that the traveler would begin to forget what their own home looked like, and the clacking of the wheels became the only rhythm their mind could hear. And this is no exaggeration. Many who lived through those journeys described a bizarre sensation, as if the train was swallowing time itself, making the days melt into one another until a person completely lost their sense of time. But the question that baffled me as I read their testimonies wasn't how did they travel, it was how did they keep their sanity, and how did they manage to steal a few fleeting moments of sleep while death was closer to them than we could ever imagine, whether by suffocating on smoke, collapsing from sheer exhaustion, or a fatal accident that could strike at any moment on those endless tracks. And perhaps for this reason, when we look at modern modes of travel today, we don't realize that the comfort we now enjoy was not born easily. Its price was paid by entire generations of humans, with nights where they never closed an eye. And before we begin this journey together, if you are one of those who loves stories that reveal the true face of history, not the glossy version we are used to seeing, then subscribe now to the Obscure Dossier channel, because what you are about to hear in a few moments might completely change the way you look at travel, at humanity, and at the price our ancestors paid for the simplest things we consider ordinary today, like a quiet night and a sleep without fear.
Imagine being forced to sit on a hard wooden bench, not for an hour, nor for two, but for an entire day, then another, and a third, while the train knows no true meaning of stopping and gives your body not a single chance to catch its breath. In the early years of steam trains, the journey wasn't the pleasant experience movies portray today. It was a daily confrontation between a human of limited strength and a giant machine that cared nothing for those inside it. And the more I reflect on the testimonies of travelers from that era, the more convinced I become that they weren't just traveling, they were surviving. The carriages were brutally simple: wooden walls, small windows that barely let in any air, and harsh seats that knew no meaning of comfort. And after just a few hours, the back would start to complain, then the neck, then the legs, as if the body was declaring its surrender part by part. As for the air, it wasn't air in the sense we know today. It was a heavy mixture of burning coal stench, hot smoke, and tiny soot particles creeping through every crack in the carriage. Some passengers would even arrive at their destination with their faces covered in a thin black layer, as if the train had left its signature on them before allowing them to leave. And as the hours passed, another battle would begin, perhaps the hardest of all, the battle of staying awake. Because sleep itself had become a bewildering enemy. The body screams from sheer exhaustion, but the very moment it tries to surrender, a violent jolt hits, or a whistle pierces the silence, or a harsh slam of wheels against the tracks, and everything goes right back to the beginning. Sometimes I imagine this scene, a man trying to rest his head on his shoulder, but barely a few minutes pass before the carriage shakes violently, slamming his head against the wooden wall. So he tries again and fails again, and after dozens of attempts, he is no longer looking for a comfortable sleep, but just a single minute to escape this torment. The exhaustion would accumulate in a way humans weren't used to. A bad night, then a worse second, then a third where the mind could barely focus. And here, strange effects mentioned by some travelers began to appear. Some felt that the noises were still chasing them even when the train stopped. Others saw shadows and movements that weren't even there, while some lost the ability to distinguish between day and night. These are symptoms we understand today as the natural result of severe sleep deprivation, but in that era, it seemed as though the train itself was messing with its passengers' minds. As for the feet, they paid a different price. Sitting for long hours in one position with little to no movement led to painful swelling in the legs and ankles. Even standing up upon arrival wasn't always easy, and some travelers needed long minutes before they could walk normally. Imagine arriving at your destination, but your body hasn't arrived yet. That is why people didn't travel by train just for the desire to travel, but because necessity alone was worth all this suffering. A trade that couldn't be delayed, a return to family, or migrating in search of a new life. As for traveling for pleasure, for many, it was an idea almost impossible to even imagine. And perhaps what draws the most attention is that humans possess an astonishing ability to adapt. After days of resistance, the mind begins to treat the noise as if it were part of the silence, and the shaking becomes familiar. Some passengers even felt a sense of strangeness when the train suddenly stopped, as if the stillness itself had become more disturbing than the motion. And this, in my opinion, is one of the most amazing aspects of human nature. For we don't just get used to comfort, we can also get used to suffering, if it lasts long enough.
But amidst all this exhaustion, there was one man who emerged from one of those journeys carrying a different kind of pain. The pain wasn't in his back, nor in his neck, but in a question that kept haunting him all along the way. Why does travel have to be this cruel? That man was named George Pullman, and in the beginning, he wasn't the owner of a giant corporation, nor a shining name in the world of railways, but simply a man who experienced for himself what thousands of travelers experienced. He sat on the exact same wooden benches, spent the night amidst the shaking and the noise, and welcomed the morning with a pale face and an exhausted body. And it seems to me that that night didn't truly end for him when the train arrived, but kept walking with him even after he left the station. It is said that some great ideas are not born in offices, but are born in a moment of distress, when a person decides they will no longer accept reality as it is. And this is exactly what happened with Pullman. Instead of cursing the terrible journey and forgetting about it, he began to wonder, why shouldn't a traveler sleep on a train just as they sleep in their own home? And why shouldn't these harsh carriages turn into a place where a person can truly rest? The idea might seem simple today, but in the mid-19th century, it was closer to madness. For how could a complete bedroom be placed inside a carriage shaking over iron tracks? How would the bed stay stable? Where would the luggage go? And how would passengers move inside such a tight space? The questions outnumbered the answers, and every answer just opened up a new problem. Despite this, Pullman started sketching, experimenting, and recalculating time and time again. He wasn't looking to make a softer seat. Rather, he was trying to invent something the railway world had never known before: a moving hotel, traveling with its passengers wherever the tracks went. But the real problem wasn't merely engineering, it was financial too. Every piece of luxurious wood, every lamp, every folding bed, and every thick curtain meant higher costs and greater risks, to the point that Pullman put a massive portion of his wealth and reputation on the line, without any guarantee that anyone would believe in his idea. And when he presented his designs to the railway companies, the shock came quickly, rejection after rejection. Company owners looked at his carriages as an unnecessary luxury. They saw them as too long, too heavy, and way too expensive. Some were convinced that a traveler wouldn't pay extra money for a few hours of sleep. And from a business perspective, this objection wasn't entirely without logic. The investment was massive, and the risk was even greater. But Pullman saw something the others didn't. He realized that people don't just buy a seat, they buy a sense of security and a comfort that preserves their dignity after days of travel. And perhaps for this reason, he didn't back down, despite the financial losses and repeated rejections, because to him, the idea was no longer just a project. It had become a battle to prove that humans deserve better treatment, even while crossing thousands of kilometers over iron. Then came the moment that changed everything, when some railway lines began testing his new carriages. The moment passengers stepped inside, they felt the difference from the very first second. Warm lights, carefully polished wood, curtains granting a bit of privacy, and seats that transformed into real beds as night fell. It wasn't an exaggerated luxury, it was a complete revolution in the concept of travel. Soon the news began to spread, and passengers were specifically requesting to travel in Pullman cars. The question among the companies was no longer, do we need these carriages? It became, how can we continue to compete without them? And here happened what often happens in history. The idea that everyone initially mocked became just a few years later a standard no one could ignore. And it is fascinating to reflect that the greatest transformations sometimes do not begin with the invention of a new machine, but begin with a human who refused to accept suffering as normal. Had it not been for that harsh night experienced by George Pullman, the world might have needed many more years to realize that sleep, even inside a train shaking over tracks, is not a luxury, but a human necessity, no less important than reaching the destination itself.
But the comfort that began to appear inside some sleeper cars did not mean that everyone started sleeping the exact same way. A single train carried within it two worlds that never meet, a world at the front and another at the back. And between them, the distance was shorter than the length of the train, but far deeper than we could ever imagine. Imagine walking down the very same corridor, then opening a door to find soft lamps, thick curtains, carefully made beds, and the scent of polished wood mingling with a faint perfume filling the space. Then you keep walking just a few carriages down, only to reach crowded wooden benches, heavy air where coal smoke mixes with the smell of damp clothes, and faces exhausted by travel before they even get close to their destination. That was the scene on many long trains. The difference wasn't just in the ticket price, it was in how the journey itself was lived. Upper-class passengers would close the doors of their compartments as night fell and lie down on comfortable beds, while the rear carriages were filled with men, women, and children trying to share a space barely enough for sitting, let alone sleeping. Some would rest their heads on an old suitcase. Another would hold their children tight in their arms to shield them from the biting cold. And there were those who remained standing for long hours because the seats were completely full. And as the number of passengers increased, breathing became harder, movement became more difficult, until sleep itself turned into a distant wish that not everyone could afford. And perhaps what draws the most attention is that the train was moving at the exact same speed for all passengers, yet it did not grant them the same journey. While one woke up on a soft pillow, another woke up because their shoulder slammed against the carriage wall, or because a child next to them burst into tears, or because a fresh wave of smoke crept inside. But there is another side to the story, one that rarely appears in old photographs and isn't talked about in many books. Those who weren't even passengers to begin with, but were the very reason for the passengers' comfort. As evening fell, and while travelers began preparing for sleep, other men were just starting their real day. Attendants, porters, and workers quietly roaming the narrow corridors, carrying blankets, making beds, gathering luggage, and answering passengers' requests, as if the night for them wasn't a time to rest, but the start of their most exhausting working hours. I pause here for a moment because this paradox is worth reflecting on. For one person to sleep peacefully, another person had to stay awake all night, and this equation has repeated itself often throughout history. The comfort of some was built on the unseen exhaustion of others. Many of these workers labored for long hours, stretching sometimes until the break of dawn, walking those narrow corridors, soothing a child who woke up terrified, helping a sick traveler, fixing a burnt-out lamp, or tucking a slipped blanket back over a passenger. And barely does all of that end before a new station begins, a new journey, and new faces, while the same exhaustion never leaves their bodies. As for the porters, their job started before the passengers even boarded, lifting heavy trunks, dragging large suitcases, then repeating the process at every station, sometimes under the rain, or in the freezing cold, or amidst endless clouds of smoke, as if the train, for them, wasn't a means of travel, but a never-ending workplace. And despite all this, history rarely immortalized the names of these men. The pictures of luxury carriages remained, the tales of the wealthy remained, but those who made those journeys possible faded into the margins, even though they were the heart that kept this moving world beating with life. And perhaps for this reason, when we reflect on the history of steam trains, we shouldn't just look at the plush beds and shining lamps, but at the tired hands that made them, and at the faces that deprived themselves of sleep so that others could sleep. Because in many instances, progress isn't forged in iron alone. It is also forged in the sweat of people who ask nothing of history save to be remembered that they once were here.
Then there were journeys that could not be described as a mere transit from one city to another. Rather, they were an entire world moving on tracks. Some transcontinental lines, like the Trans-Siberian Railway, stretched for thousands of kilometers, to the point that a traveler might spend a week or more without seeing the end of the journey. Try to imagine that. You wake up in the morning to find the window displaying an endless forest. Then you sleep and wake up the next day to find the snow still stretching to the horizon. Then another day passes, and another day, while the train keeps moving, and the outside world slowly changes. As for you, you are still in the exact same spot, on the same bed, and between the same walls. And here, the challenge was no longer about enduring the seat or resisting the smoke. The real challenge became maintaining your psychological balance. Because humans, by nature, need a sense of stability. They need ground that does not move, walls they recognize, and a routine that gives them a sense of security. But inside the train, all these things disappeared. The shaking never stopped, not even during sleep, nor while eating, nor while reading. And after many long days, the mind begins to treat the motion as if it were the only natural state. In fact, some passengers recounted that when they finally stepped down onto solid ground, they felt as though the earth itself was moving beneath their feet, not the train. And this, in truth, shows us just how far the brain can reprogram its perception of the world when forced to do so. As for the noise, it wasn't just annoying sounds. It was a constant companion that never left them for a single moment. The clacking of the wheels, the clash of iron against iron, the howling of the wind, and the breathing of the steam engine, all blending into a single rhythm, repeating thousands of times until it became a part of their very thoughts. And perhaps for this reason, some travelers said they kept hearing the sound of the train in their heads, even days after the journey had ended.
But humans, as usual, tried to adapt to everything. Some passengers would read the same book several times, not because they forgot its content, but because time became too vast to be easily filled. Others would stare out the window for hours, watching the trees, the rivers, and the mountains as they passed by incredibly slowly, until the scenery itself turned into a form of silent meditation. And as the days passed, a strange phenomenon began to emerge. No one knew exactly what day it was anymore, nor did they feel the passage of hours the way they did outside the train. Day and night repeated, but the sense of time gradually faded away, as if the journey wasn't just traveling over the tracks, but was also traveling inside the human mind, altering its way of perceiving time. And sometimes this repetition drove some passengers to the edge of a psychological breakdown, not because of a terrifying event, but because of the absence of any real change. The same sound, the same shaking, the same corridor, the same faces, day after day, to the point that the simplest new sight, like a small village or a remote station, seemed like an extraordinary event worth gathering at the windows to watch. And as I reflect on all these testimonies, I cannot help but remember the saying of the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. Travel is a piece of torment. It prevents one of you from his sleep, his food, and his drink. And the deeper I delve into the history of those journeys, the more certain I become that this description carries a meaning that goes far beyond mere physical hardship. For travel, no matter how advanced its methods become, temporarily uproots a human from their stability, deprives them of much of what they are used to, and puts them face to face with their own human frailty. Man has tried to tame iron, to make fire a means of comfort, and to turn the train into a moving home, and succeeded in many things. But one thing remained exactly the same, that hidden feeling that you are far from your land,
far from your bed and far from everything that brings you tranquility. And perhaps for this reason, travel remains a test of patience before it is a test of endurance. And perhaps the most beautiful thing we can learn from these long journeys is that humans, no matter how much progress they achieve, remain creatures who need peace of mind more than they need speed, and need the mercy of God in every step they take away from their homes. Because while modes of transportation may shorten distances, they cannot erase a truth that has accompanied mankind for thousands of years, that there is hardship in travel, and that returning home was and will always remain one of the greatest blessings a human being can ever feel.
And so, after long decades of noise and smoke, the steam monster began to lose its awe little by little. It wasn't defeated in a single battle, nor did it vanish overnight, but it watched the world around it change rapidly while it remained carrying the scars of a bygone era. Quieter engines emerged, and more powerful ones. Then came modes of transport that condensed journeys that once took entire weeks down to days, then to a mere few hours. And suddenly, people were no longer willing to spend long nights with their beds shaking with every meter the train covered, and black smoke was no longer a natural part of travel as it once was. But it is unfair, in my opinion, to view steam trains as merely old machines whose time has passed, because they were so much more than that. They were the bridge that connected cities that had never known each other, and brought entire continents closer than they had ever been throughout history, carrying on their tracks millions of dreams, countless letters, and families who parted ways only to be reunited once again. However, this achievement was never without a cost. Behind every iron track that stretched across mountains and valleys, there were hands that bled while laying the rails, and backs that bent while carrying timber and steel, and faces blackened by coal before anyone even saw them. And behind every successful journey, there were long nights spent by travelers fighting exhaustion, by workers fighting sleep, and by engineers who risked their fortunes and their lives so that travel could become a little less cruel than it was. Sometimes, when I sit inside a modern train, or even inside a plane crossing thousands of kilometers in a few short hours, I think of a very simple thing: how ordinary sleep seems today. We rest our heads against the seat, then we wake up nearing our destination. But roughly 150 years ago, this simple dream, the dream of sleeping a few hours without fear, suffocation, or pain, was considered a privilege unknown to most people. We have grown so accustomed to plush seats, to heating and air conditioning, and to tightly sealed windows that we've forgotten that every little detail we take for granted today came as the result of thousands of attempts, dozens of failures, and long years of suffering. For history does not build the comfort of future generations with ideas alone. It also builds it with the price paid by the generations before it. And perhaps this is the most beautiful lesson in this entire story, that progress does not erase the pain that preceded it, it stands upon it. As if every comfortable means of travel we use today hides within it the tales of people who never knew that comfort at all, but who, without even realizing it, were crafting it for those who would come after them.
And because of this, if you ever find yourself complaining about a delayed flight or a seat that wasn't as comfortable as you expected, remember that there was a time when people considered simply arriving alive at their destination an achievement worthy of gratitude. As for a peaceful sleep, it was a luxury they dreamed of far more than they ever experienced. And now, cast your imagination back to that very first night, an old station, cold air, a long whistle piercing the silence, and an iron monster spewing smoke, preparing to depart. Its passengers had no idea how much exhaustion awaited them, and they had no idea either that with their patience and suffering, they were writing a chapter that would make travel easier for millions of humans who would come after them. The sound of those locomotives has faded from most parts of the world. Their chimneys have gone quiet, and their wheels have stopped turning, but their legacy has never ceased. It still lives on in every quiet journey, in every comfortable seat, and in every night we drift off to sleep while traveling, without ever stopping to think about the heavy price others paid, just so we could have a few hours of sleep in peace.